You read Acts 2, 42 to 47, and you might think that this was a one-off. After people's first experience of the Holy Spirit, surely they had to, once they'd become the church, do what churches do. In other words, settle down. Establish a routine. Lose a bit of that dangerous over-enthusiasm, particularly when it comes to selling one's possessions and giving to those in need. Acts 2, on this reading, isn't meant to be typical. It's not meant to be the pattern of the church for all time. But then you read something like Philippians 2, verses 1 to 13, and you become aware that something very much like the situation described in Acts 2 is exactly the pattern for what Paul wants to see happening amongst the Philippians. Notice that in the Philippians passage, verses 2 to 4 describe exactly what the first converts in Jerusalem had begun to do immediately after the day of Pentecost. Now, with the 4 ifs in verse 1, Paul isn't suggesting that unless this kind of life is happening amongst them, they haven't been united with Christ, or receiving comfort from his love, or in fellowship with the Spirit, or that they are completely lacking in tenderness or compassion. He's not saying they're not real converts. He's saying that's not it. Not by any means. As their evangelist, his joy will be, verse 2, incomplete, unless he knows that this life, what shall we call it, the Acts 2 pattern, is being lived out amongst them. And I can only presume that he would want it lived out amongst us. So what to do? Where shall we begin? He wants us to be like-minded. How do you do that? Get one person to do all the thinking? Ban everyone from expressing their opinions? All go along with the loudest voice or the most forceful personality? I don't think so. Take this with the rest of verse 2 if you want to see how to go about nurturing the right kind of unity amongst ourselves. Like-mindedness, notice it's like-minded, not same-minded, arises out of having the same love. Now, so does unity of spirit and purpose. Whatever we love gives us our focus, doesn't it? Our goal. And in church, we don't have to agree on the means if we're getting to the same end. So what can we do to generate this kind of like-mindedness amongst ourselves? Surely it's only going to grow out of a serious commitment to worshipping Jesus. And I don't just mean the songs. What can get in the way of this happening? Well, selfish ambition or vain conceit. Verse 3. In the first case, we're not just thinking about people who want to run the show. Selfish ambitions are anything that you covet purely for yourself. Likewise, vain conceits are any ways in which we like to think of ourselves, ways that we would like others to think of us. It's still a vain conceit if I say, oh, I am just a poor, shy, ordinary person. If that then keeps me stuck to my seat when there's someone who needs a welcome, then that's exactly what Paul wants to avoid. I'm guessing that we probably all have hundreds of these selfish ambitions or vain conceits all jostling for space in our thoughts. That's not necessarily a problem. Just don't let them start controlling our actions. Just one thing to say about verse 4. To those whose big fear about Acts 2 model is that they're being asked to completely forget about their own interests, look at what it says. Not only, but also. Not only to their own interests, but also to the interests of others. It isn't possible to understand how to care for the interests of others unless we have some kind of grounding in looking after our own interests. Now, this isn't just Paul talking about some kind of ideal world. He's saying what should happen. He says it in verse 5. Why? Because our attitude should be the same as that of Christ. After all, if he can let go his grasp of equality with God and identify with me in my need and humbling himself, put no limits at all on his trust in the Father and his obedience, surely I can release my grip on what I think it means to be Duncan Wright. If I can't, then why not? Am I too proud? Or is there not enough fear and trembling in my relationship with God, see verses 12 and 13, and too much of it in my relationship with my fellow human beings? Enough. If you have been, thank you for listening.